Welcome. This webinar is brought to you by the New Hampshire Training Institute on Addictive Disorders. You can access the recording of this webinar on our website at www.nhadaca.org within our webinar library. After completing this webinar, please complete the quiz and evaluation if you're interested in receiving a certificate. If you are a member of NHADACA or NADAC, the certificate for this webinar is free. If you are not a member, the fee is $15. You will receive a certificate worth 0.75 continuing education credits once you have completed the evaluation, passed the quiz, and paid for the webinar if applicable. Through the New Hampshire Training Institute on Addictive Disorders, this 0.75-hour event is pre-approved by the New Hampshire Board of Licensing for alcohol and other drug use professionals as well as NBCC, ASAP number 6754. If you have any trouble viewing the webinar, have audio problems, or have any technical questions, please contact us at 603-225-7060. You can email any questions regarding the materials you see today to training@nhadaca.org.
Welcome to our webinar, Understanding, Identifying, and Screening for Problem Gambling. My name is Ed Talbot, and I formerly served as the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Council on Problem Gambling, and now coordinate recovery services for the council. I'm also an individual in long-term recovery from this addiction, with 45 years since my last bet. I'm joined today by Dr. Angela Bird, the new Executive Director of our council. Good morning, Angela.
Good morning, Ed. Thank you.
Before we begin our webinar, I'd like to speak a little bit about the history of the New Hampshire Council. The council was incorporated in 1996, and it was operated in conjunction with the Vermont Council on Problem Gambling. The National Council on Problem Gambling in 2010 advised that each state should operate independently. And a small group of volunteers worked to reestablish the New Hampshire Council to its nonprofit status. The Internal Revenue approved our application in 2014. The New Hampshire Council on Problem Gambling survived on private donations, contributions, and in-kind services from the New Hampshire Lottery and a grant from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation until 2020. The legislation to approve sports betting in the state created a commission, the New Hampshire Council for Responsible Gambling, which would assure that services for problem gambling would be provided and funded. Our council was awarded a contract for 3 years to provide these services, and we are in the final year of that contract. Today's webinar is being recorded with our partners at New Hampshire Alcohol and Drug Counselors Association, and we are grateful for their assistance and support. Before turning it over to Dr. Bergen, I would like to disclose that the New Hampshire Council and today's presenters are neutral on legalized gambling. We neither endorse nor oppose gambling, but strongly advocate for services to those adversely affected by gambling. New Hampshire Council on Problems Gambling is a nonprofit agency created to address the social, financial, and emotional cost of problem gambling. The council provides information, education, advocacy, and prevention services. Referrals to treatment for problem gambling to those afflicted, their loved ones, and the community.
Thank you, Ed. So before we talk about gambling disorder prevalence, one thing I wanted to share is that as a mental health clinician coming from this clinical space with my background, I've definitely noticed there is a lack of conversation going on about problem gambling. And so I'm really honored to have joined forces with Ed to share this information and make it more mainstream practice that we are screening for and referring to gambling disorder services. So thank you, Ed, for the background on the council and sharing the mission. And so diving into some of our information we want to share with you all about gambling disorder, problem gambling, is one of the things is the prevalence. And so the prevalence of gambling disorder and problem gambling is a lot greater than I certainly would have thought. And the range is pretty wide for a reason. So in New Hampshire, the statistics tell us that anywhere from 7,800 to 65,000 people might have experienced gambling related problems during their lifetime. The range is wide. There are different levels of gambling, which we will be talking about shortly. And also, we're still working to best capture the accuracy on the statistics with how many people are affected and how. Gambling disorder is a diagnosis in the DSM-5. And although conceptually we're still, grasping at the prevalence of gambling disorder, those of us in the clinical field do have more of a mental concept around the frequency of things like obsessive compulsive disorder and schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder. So although we're less familiar right now with the prevalence of gambling disorder, it is interesting to know that it is about as common as these other disorders I just mentioned, which we do have a lot of familiarity around. So we're hoping to increase our knowledge base so that we understand the prevalence is about the same for those disorders.
Thank you, Angela. I'd like to talk a little bit about the levels of gambling. And no one is brought up wanting to be a compulsive gambler, but it's a very progressive addiction. And most gamblers go through the 3 phases. Social gambling, which represents 95% of the population today. People who gamble responsibly, occasionally, with no adverse effects. Then there are the problem gamblers. There may be a temporary negative effect at home, a financial problem, problems at work, or a legal situation.
And thinking about some of the indicators we want to look for when evaluating for a gambling problem, we're going to look at different criteria, just as we do with substance use disorder. And you will notice a parallel with the criteria because they are so similar in nature. So the first is preoccupation, and this is the amount of time spent thinking about or acquiring access to or engaging in gambling. Of course, that is going to be very high as this progresses. Another is increased tolerance. So as with substance use disorder, the amount or frequency of or stakes of or variety of gambling is going to increase over time to get that, the level of excitement, pleasure that is taking place in the beginning of gambling disorder. So the tolerance level is going to increase over time. A person is going to, like Ed had mentioned, try to stop gambling, but that is going to be very difficult, if not completely unsuccessful at first with no support. So that's another indication that there is a compulsive gambling level. Also being restless or irritable when cutting back or stopping gambling, just as with substance use disorders, this withdrawal effect is taking place where when the person is not engaging in the behavior, there are some negative effects of that they are experiencing. Also using gambling as an escape. We see that with maladaptive stress coping pattern, where a person is using gambling as a means of escaping stress, overwhelm, anxiety, etc. Also, Ed had talked about this idea of chasing. After losing, the person may be more inclined to bet more to catch up with their losses. Lying about gambling, which doesn't necessarily just have to be like overt lies, it can also be hiding the level of not tell the full truth. Also, illegal acts to support gambling, getting into some trouble financially, that level of desperation, jeopardizing significant relationships or opportunities. The effects on a family system when there is problem gambling going on can be very significant and sometimes devastating. So that's an indicator to look for. And finally, relying on others for money, whether that means relying on other people to have access to money to gamble with, or if a person has utilized their own resources, they may utilize the resources of other people to achieve their basic needs.
The risk factors for problem gambling. A compulsive gambler, pathological gambler may exhibit one or more of these: emotional difficulties, not being able to handle the life on life's terms, stress, a certain amount of stress, and the gambler uses his addiction as an escape to get away from the reality of whatever is causing the stress. A distorted expectation about winning, always dreaming that his solution to everything is this big win. It's going to take care of everyone, make them happy, he'll have money, and the gambling will continue. A very distorted version, because as we all know, the house always wins. The social pressure to gamble. And this is probably more evident today than gambling today is glamorized. Prior to the casinos being established pretty much across the country, and it's an attractive venue to go to for an entertainment, a show, a night out, gambling was always kind of the dark room thing with loan sharks and bookies. But today it's glamorized and there's more social pressure in order to gamble. Risky gambling behavior. I know myself, I can look back in the very, very early years of my gambling. I was with a bunch of guys and I placed a $100 bet on a Greyhound. And I know I can recall everything about the race, but most importantly, what stands out was almost shaking with nervous energy and that tremendous rush just before the race started. That risk-taking was as much of a turn on as actually winning a race. Impulsivity. The answer to everything was always to respond by gambling. Never considering anything. For example, I worked at a racetrack. I couldn't take a night off, daughter's birthday, something other planned a family event and that, I had to be there. Even holidays was always, couldn't be there, I had to be at the track. Illusion of a controls of outcome. I always felt I had a system. I knew more about greyhounds than anybody. I had a PhD in greyhound racing. And as I say now at meetings, it bought me a seat in recovery. Addiction history. Many people, especially today, comorbidity is really on the rise. And we'll talk more later about the high evidence of problem gambling and substance use disorder. But I see that more and more today. Criminal history. People in the criminal justice system will frequently turn to that as an escape, trying to win some money. And then finally, a family history of gambling problems. That wasn't present in my family. And it's funny, when my dad found out that I gambled, he said, gee, he said, I don't know whether you got this from me. I mean, we had only went to the racetrack once. And I remember that we were on a vacation and something. And he took me to the track with him one night. We bet a couple of races and walked out of there. I said, Dad, did this have anything to do with you? It was my choice to behave. So that was that.
Thanks, Ed. All right, we've got a discussion question for you to consider. What are the 3 most popular forms of gambling? You could take a second, think about the answer, and Ed will share more thoughts with us.
Today,
All right, Ed, tell us about it.
Today, the numerical order has changed. It was always the big 3 with the lottery, sports gambling, and the casino. And casino and lottery were battling for number 1 for many, many years. Sports gambling was 3rd, probably because that was more being done on offshore betting or with bookies. Today, with the legalization of sports betting, sports gambling and the lottery are running 1 and 2, and casino gambling has stepped back into 3rd place if we go by the helpline calls. Part of that is the COVID impact that on the casino industry, but now they're back and running again. So I'm sure casino gambling will move up to battle with the other 2. But those are the 3 types most popular.
Thanks, Ed. All right, a little bit more about problem gambling and substance use disorder overlap. So we know that these 2 disorders do have a lot in common, like we've already talked about. Both can exacerbate the other, of course, as well. So here we have a statistic that a high percentage, 76% of those presenting with a gambling problem also experience problems with alcohol and other drugs. So of that 76%, most, 72%, have experienced a problem with alcohol. So most of our folks struggling with problem gambling also have a history of struggling with alcohol as well. Some, 38%, have also experienced problems with other drugs, with a little bit of overlap for some polysubstance there as well. What we know from brain imaging research is that an addiction to gambling behavior has the same physiological pattern within the brain as substance use disorder. The reward system within the brain is being stimulated and the behavior is being reinforced just as it does from substance abuse.
The differences with gambling problem and substance abuse. First of all, there's no presence of a substance or on obvious signs, or bailouts by families and friends usually occur with gambling versus substance abuse. When we talked about the slurred speech, the bloodshot eyes, and the odor that may be present in a person with the substance use disorder, the gambler indicates in no way that there is presently a problem. He could be in complete turmoil inside, but to anyone on the street, and this used to aggravate people who knew I had a problem, that everybody thought I was such a great guy. Yeah, the great guy was taking bets for these people up to the track, so of course they liked them. The other thing is with a problem gambler, the gambler occasionally has a win. And that kind of reinforces that what I'm doing is right. I've got the system. I can do it. A person with an alcohol or drug problem also would not smoke another joint or drink another beer and figure that that would solve all the problems. Where the compulsive gambler thinks the next bet he makes is going to be the one that turns everything around, and he lives in that dream world that everything is going to be resolved with his next win.
Okay, shifting gears a little to gambling disorder and mental health. So as we've talked about, there is a significant overlap between gambling disorder and substance abuse disorder. And we know that substance use disorder and mental health also go hand in hand. So therefore, it follows that gambling disorder, of course, is going to have a seat with mental health as well. So of those with a history of a gambling disorder, here's some statistics as far as mental health. 56% also report a history of a mood disorder. 60% report a history of an anxiety disorder. 42% report a history of an impulse control disorder. And again, that's 76% who report a history of a substance use disorder. Now, one of the significant questions we ask in the clinical field is, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Because we're interested in how we're going to find these folks and also how we're going to treat them. What is the underlying issue that we need to work on? So when it comes to those folks with a history of gambling disorder who also have a history of a mood disorder, 65% of those individuals said that the mood disorder came first. So the question of where are we going to find these folks so that we can get them the help that they need? Well, in this case, we're going to find a lot of these folks in the mental health arena. So this is important for clinicians to know and understand. Of those who have a history of gambling disorder and anxiety disorder, 82% said the anxiety disorder came first. So we're more likely to see these folks presenting with anxiety rather than walking in the door saying, hi, I have a gambling disorder and I'd like some help. So we need to know what questions to ask to find these individuals. When it comes to impulse control disorder, 100% of folks have said the impulse control disorder came before the gambling disorder. And finally, with substance use, more than half are saying the substance use disorder came first. So again, this points us in the direction of, in the mental health and substance spaces, this is where we can be asking the question about gambling disorder so that these individuals are not falling through the cracks based on, being identified as diagnosed with and treated for a mental health or substance use disorder, rather than asking questions about gambling as well.
Gambling problem with suicide. In the 20 questions in the Gamblers Anonymous screening, the last one is, have you ever considered suicide or attempting suicide because of your gambling problem? And initially, a lot of people will answer no to that. However, as time goes on, more and more people will express even the ideation of a suicide attempt. But the National Council on Problem Gambling, citing various studies, reports 1 in 5 compulsive gamblers has attempted suicide, a rate higher than any other addiction. It used to be that it was 5 times higher than any other, but a recent survey out of Australia indicates it may be as much as 10 to 15%, 10 to 15 times higher than any other addiction. Unfortunately, in my career in recovery, I've known 2 people who were in a recovery 12-step program who eventually committed suicide, and absolutely baffling individuals that you wouldn't expect that this would happen. They were engaged in a recovery program, struggle at times, but eventually wound up ending their life because of the gambling problem.
Thanks, Ed. I actually do know an individual as well who died by suicide as a result of a gambling disorder. And the effects that it had on his family were devastating, not only because of the suicide, but also the amount of debt that had been incurred. So again, these folks are feeling like there's no other way out, and that's scary. We need to be able to identify them so we can get them the help that they need, which leads us to our next topic of screening. So in any kind of medical or mental health establishment, we have screening tools to ask about depression and anxiety and other mental health symptoms and disorders. We have screening questions we ask in medical and mental health facilities about substance use, and that is mainstream. That's what we do. We also have screeners to ask about suicidal ideation, and this is becoming much more common, again, in medical and mental health establishments. So where's the gambling questions though? That's what we're here to do, is to share this knowledge so that we can change the way that we do things mainstream. We would like for problem gambling questions to be included in some of these basic screeners that are being used in medical and mental health establishments. So the tool of choice that is very easy to administer, easy for anybody to administer, is something called the BBGS, which is the Brief Biosocial Gambling Screen. The BBGS has 3 main questions that can be asked, and it's going to help identify folks who are struggling with gambling. First question, during the last 12 months, have you become restless, irritable, or anxious when trying to stop or cut down on gambling? So that's asking about that withdrawal piece of addiction. Second question, during the last 12 months, have you tried to keep your family or friends from knowing how much you gambled? That's going to speak a little bit to their difficulties with being honest regarding their gambling and possibly identifying any shame that's being hidden. Last question, during the last 12 months, did you have such financial trouble as a result of your gambling that you had to get help with living expenses from family, friends, or from welfare? And I think this last question, specifically in a clinical space, I know in my line of work, that is a question that's very easy to ask because a lot of folks are really struggling financially, and asking the question to learn a little bit more about maybe the reason for that financial stress. It may be that there's a gambling disorder lurking under the surface that is contributing to the financial distress that we won't know unless we ask about. So again, in the medical and mental health spaces, we're asking screening questions about mental health and substances and even suicidal ideation. And the hope is that we can create a mainstream change that we're also asking questions about problem gambling.
Our next discussion question is compulsive gambling a physiological or psychological addiction?
Okay, so this is one of my favorite questions because it speaks to the age-old debate of nature versus nurture. The answer, my favorite answer, yes and yes. It's a 2-part yes answer. Yes, compulsive gambling is a physiological addiction, and yes, compulsive gambling is also a psychological addiction. What we know about the physiological piece, when we think of mental health, we approach it from this biopsychosocial approach. Bio meaning the physiological piece, and psychosocial meaning the psychological pieces. So as we think about gambling disorder and compulsive gambling, in terms of that physiological perspective, we think about the brain, we think about the reward system like we talked about, where as we engage in gambling behavior, it triggers the reward system in the brain. We release that feel-good neurotransmitter dopamine. That feels excellent, so we do that behavior again and again and again. So physiologically, we can become addicted to that behavior of gambling, and that is going to also then lead to tolerance, which is needing to gamble either more frequently with higher stakes or in more of a variety of different, ways that a person can gamble in order to achieve that same effect. And also the withdrawal piece, where a person will experience negative side effects basically from trying to cut back or stop gambling. So all of those things are indicating that yes, compulsive gambling is a physiological addiction. In addition, however, a psychological addiction is a little bit different, where we've got that psychosocial piece, but there's a lot of different factors that can play into the way we can become psychologically addicted to any behavior. So from that psychosocial standpoint, we might ask questions that are familiar in the substance use world as well, like what are some of the underlying social and emotional struggles a person has? What are the other pieces of this puzzle? what stressors or factors of overwhelm might be going on in the person's life where they are looking to escape or numb those things. Is there any history of trauma a person might be trying to bury through the behavioral pattern of compulsive gambling? Also, the social piece, gambling is very normalized in our culture, and certain communities can very much glamorize, as Ed was saying, glamorize this idea of gambling. And, when something becomes so normalized and glamorized, that's a recipe for disaster if the proper supports aren't in place. Also, as with any human behavior, we are motivated by certain things, including a sense of belonging. So creating like a friend group around gambling, and I'm sure Ed can speak to this as well, you have this sense of belonging, and it can also be part of the social piece that can be addicting, that can make you feel like this is where I belong. These are my people. I'm gonna come back tomorrow, and I'll.
Hi, I'm Doreen, compulsive gambler, and I'll give you a little history about myself. I started gambling back in 2002, and my first experience was a trip to Las Vegas. I went there with my husband. We enjoyed ourselves. I noticed that I spent a lot of time at the casino, and my gambling was with slot machines. I continued to gamble on occasion, but it wasn't really a full-time thing for me. I did it when I had a chance, which wasn't very often. I worked full-time, I was in the military, so that was my focus. But whenever I did get away to go gamble, whether it be Vegas or up to Foxwoods, I would be there day and night. I would stay at the slot machines, I would drink, I would gamble all night long. I'd go up to the room for an hour or two, come back down, continue gambling for the next day. I missed a lot of family things. I missed a lot of shows. I was so obsessed with the slot machines that I couldn't even leave the slot machine. I was thrown out a few times because I would fall asleep at the machine. That's how bad I was getting. I continued gambling until around 2018. But prior to that, I had to start taking care of my mom. She ended up with dementia, And so at that point, whenever I could get away, I started gambling out of control. I had nothing really to hold me back except for having to be there for my mom or trying to manage care for her. So in 2018, which is October 11th, I finally sought help. Financially, I was pretty stable. I had, even though when I worked, I had always had, access to money. I had access to credit cards. I had access to a lot of funds. But then when I started caring for my mom, I had access to her money also because it was right there and it was available to me. So I actually started using her funds. And what happened is I wasn't asking. I was taking and returning and taking and returning. And finally that really guilted me. And I told her about it, and she forgave me and said, just, make sure you pay me back. But I couldn't forgive myself. And then I went on a trip to Aruba with the girls. I was at the casino. I ran out of my money, so I went back to the hotel. I went into the safe, and I ended up borrowing money that wasn't mine once again. One of my girlfriends saw me in the safe. She saw me taking the money, and the look on her face was just so horrifying that I got home, and within a month I was out seeking help because I couldn't live with myself any longer. Getting professional help at the VA in Bedford. I spent 3.5 weeks there, and it was a great program. I was able to focus on myself. I didn't have to worry about other things going on in my life. So I was able to take care of myself, and I know a lot of people aren't offered that opportunity. And for the next few months, I had GA meetings. I did group therapy sessions. I had a therapist. I also had a psychiatrist, so I was fortunate. And then I actually went to a GA program that the VA offered in Cleveland, Ohio, and that was a 5-week GA only program. So I really got to focus on the addiction itself, how it affects people, and it just has been almost 4 years now, and I'm gambling and alcohol free. My life has just turned around, and I couldn't be happier.
Okay, the resources for help. The New Hampshire Council on Problem Gambling maintains a helpline, 603-724-1605. Operational 24/7. It's manned by yours truly at the present time. We're looking for other options. It's getting very, very busy with the advent of sports gambling. The number of calls to the helpline have increased. Additionally, Gamblers Anonymous nationwide website, www.gamblersanonymous.org. Will give you the meetings in any state in the United States, covered by time, day of the week, type of meeting. Gamblers Anonymous also locally in New Hampshire, there are 2 groups. Thursday night, an in-person group in Hampstead, New Hampshire, at the Unitarian Church on Main Street in Hampstead. That's Thursday night at 7:30. And a meeting on Tuesday night, which was a hybrid meeting at Hope for Recovery, New Hampshire, 293 Wilson Street in Manchester, is also available on Zoom. And weekly, I attend that meeting most weeks, and usually there's 10 to 12 people present at the in-person meeting and another 15 to 20 online. It's a very good meeting, runs for an hour, 15 minutes. So, but it's an excellent way, especially for newcomers, to go on, and you're not required to speak, to listen and to learn from others of the problems with gambling. Also, the voluntary self-exclusion support now that is really grown in the industry, whether it's casino gambling, even sports gambling now, where people can sign themselves out of the casino. They're prevented from going back, facing either a trespassing violation. Also, any money they may have won would be confiscated if they had self-excluded themselves and still went back in. This is available through DraftKings as well. They do it for different periods of time. You can do it for a cooling off period, 30 days, 60 days, 9 months, a year, or for life. Most casino gamblers who choose to do it through the casino, they do it for life and are barred from going back in there. So that's one extra benefit of the industry being involved in not wanting the problem gambler and to get to this point of people gambling responsibly.
And if anybody needs any support with self-exclusion or the know-how how to do that, calling the helpline is a great option too, because we have plenty of support we can provide around self-exclusion.
We heard Doreen's story, and a few weeks ago at the Manchester meeting, they decided that they were going to do this new project where you did a where I was, where I am today, and what helped me get there. So I had to participate, and I did mine, and I'm going to provide you with my story and how my gambling career accelerated, progressed, and led to a joyful life in recovery. Where was I? In July of 1977, my wife had experienced enough of my lies, false promises, and deceits regarding my gambling and wanted me out of the house. At the time, I was happy to oblige her. I had quit my full-time sales job and was working as an administrative part-time job at Rainham Dog Track. The meet was due to end shortly and Taunton Dog Track would open. The opportunity to devote all my time to gambling seemed attractive, and initially it was. Taunton opened with 30 days of matinee racing, and my luck returned. I went on a winning streak and gambled, partied, and felt there was no stopping me. I was living with my widowed father, sponging off him and focusing all on my wants and needs, and avoiding any responsibility I had as a husband, a father, and a son. Afternoon racing ended and the night racing began. As it did, my luck also changed. I gambled more than I ever had, borrowed more than I ever did, and lied to myself and to others that I didn't have a problem. On the final night of racing, the last race, I bet what little money I had on a dog aptly named Perfect Treasure. The starting box opened, the dogs came out, and Perfect Treasure fell, and my dream world came crashing down. 5 days later, I contemplated suicide with a dive off a bridge over the Taunton River. Where am I today? Happily today, I am gambling free and my life has truly been blessed. I remarried and my daughter has provided me with 2 wonderful grandchildren, and my stepdaughter matched that. I recently turned 80 and plan to retire fully next year. I had a wonderful career in corrections and retired in 2002 as the Chief of Staff of the Bristol County Sheriff's Office in Massachusetts. The majority of my time in corrections was spent working with addicted offenders and proved very rewarding. I've had a home in Madison, New Hampshire for over 30 years and always envisioned retiring there. I currently serve as the Recovery Services Coordinator with the National New Hampshire Council on Problem Gambling and have met some of you on a helpline. My wife has a home in southeastern Mass, and we split our time between locations as she cares for a 92-year-old mother, and we attend many of the activities of the grandchildren. My wife, who has known me for 33 years, can't believe I was that other person. I'm still very committed to GA and many weeks attend a Monday night meeting in South Dartmouth, Mass, as well as our Tuesday night hybrid session. My lifestyle today centers around family, faith, program, and exercise. How did I get there? The only reason I didn't take that suicide dive was I didn't believe my daughter needed me to cop out that way. I hadn't been much of a dad and wanted a chance to change that. I went to see a priest who recommended Gamblers Anonymous and professional counseling. I visited the psychologist who also recommended Gamblers Anonymous. I went to my first meeting in Fall River, Massachusetts on December 13, 1977. Initially, I had a hard time accepting I was powerless over gambling, but I knew my life was unmanageable. I met a great group of guys in recovery who brought me to 4 meetings a week, and it finally caught on. I am frequently asked how I have done it, and my answer never changes. For me, I have used 1, the Gamblers Anonymous 12-step program, 2, professional counseling for the first 6 months I was in recovery, 3, a different relationship with a higher power, who I choose to call God, and 4, a healthy lifestyle, which included losing 75 pounds, quitting a 2.5 pack a day cigarette habit, eating healthy, and exercise. I ran for 35 years, which included 20 marathons, and still walked 4 to 5 miles a day. I tried willpower several times and it never worked. So I'll stick with this formula. Thank you.
Ed, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's such an inspiration, and I hope that it resonates with everybody watching this video.
In closing, the losses associated with problem gambling are greater than financial. The impact of the cycle of addiction demands smart and effective solutions. We at the New Hampshire Council on Problem Gambling understand the problem, and we can help. Call our helpline, 603-225-9540 for the office, or the helpline at 603-724-1605.
Thank you so much for attending our training.